So if you've been paying attention to the smartphone business recently, then you'll probably know what's going on with Huawei. Now, really quickly, if you're unfamiliar with Huawei, Huawei is a smartphone brand and they're known for making smartphones. You may have never heard of Huawei. That's because in the States, they're not big at all. They're a company based out of China, and since they're a company based out of China, that's probably why you may have never heard of Huawei. But Huawei is actually one of the biggest distributors of smartphones around the world. Actually, they're just as big as something like an Apple or like a Samsung when it comes to smartphones. They're not a small company. They're one of the world's largest distributors of smartphones in the world. But recently, Huawei is in a bit of a pickle when it comes to smartphones or when it comes to their company as a whole. And I'm going to explain this situation as best as I can in this video. Now, I don't know all the ins and outs, to be honest, about this situation that's going on with Huawei, but I can tell you overall in the big grand scheme of things what's actually going on. So basically what's going on with Huawei right now, they pretty much are being banned in America and they're not allowed to have any communications or any partnership or any deals with American companies. That's pretty much what's going on. I don't know why. I think it has something to do with Trump and something to do with China. They're not getting along and they're not making good deals out. I think that's the reason why Huawei cannot have any ties with any American companies or do any business with American companies. So you can see that's really going to hurt Huawei in the long run. Some people are actually saying that this may actually make them go broke in the long run. Who really knows what's going to happen while this ban is going on and while Huawei is not allowed to talk to American companies for any business deals. But basically that is bad for their brand, because the reason it's bad for their brand is the number one thing that Huawei is known for right now is actually smartphones. Huawei actually does other things than just make smartphones, if you're unaware. They also work in networking, so they have networking equipment. They also make laptops, and they also make their own processing chip, believe it or not. So you can see they do more than just smartphone business. But their number one thing that they do best is smartphone business. And since they're not allowed to have any ties with any American companies, that ultimately means it's going to hurt their brand as a whole and hurt their company as a whole, because what do their smartphones run on? Their smartphones run on Android. And since their smartphones do run on Android, unfortunately, Android is owned by Google. And since Google's own Android, they're not allowed to use Android on their smartphones. So ultimately, it is going to hurt their smartphone brand, since they won't be able to put Android on their Android smartphones, and that's ultimately going to hurt their brand as a whole. Now, there are more articles coming out every day talking about this whole situation with Huawei being banned in America and Huawei not being able to have any ties with any American companies. And overall, it looks like this situation from day to day is not getting any better for Huawei, and it looks like Huawei is in a lot of trouble when it comes to their brand. Luckily, it looks like since they are one of the biggest manufacturers of smartphones in the world, it does look like they are trying to deal with this situation as best as possible. And I want to talk about also, do I think what's ultimately going to happen to their company? Do I personally think they're going to go broke? Do I think that they're going to close up? Or what's actually going to happen to their company? Now, one of the biggest things is, of course, their OS. They're using Android on their smartphone. Luckily, when it comes to Android, if you don't know anything about Android behind the scenes, there's actually two versions of Android. There's an Android that has to be certified from Google, since Google does own Android. But luckily, when it comes to Android from Google, they don't care if you use Android, and you don't actually have to have Android certified when it comes to using Android on your device, whether it's a tablet or whether it's a smartphone. You do not have to have it certified. There's actually a way to just download Android. Anybody can have access to and put it on your device, but that ultimately is not a good version of Android, because when you don't get a certification from Google, that pretty much means your smartphone is not going to have the Google Play Store, and that's a really big deal when it comes to these smart devices that have Android running on it. If you cannot get that Google certification, that ultimately means you're not going to get the Google Play Store, and that's where you download your applications to your actual smart device. So that is not good. If Huawei does decide to go with the Android version that does not have the Google certification on it, that doesn't mean you can't still use things like YouTube or any Google applications on your smartphone. Yes, you can still use Google applications on your smartphone, whether we're talking about a web browser, or if you don't know anything about Android specifically, you can actually sideload different things to your device. So there are a number of different ways to get around it if they did decide to go with the different version of Android that's not the certified Android from Google, but ultimately this will hurt them, because if you don't have that certification, how can people really trust your device? How can people really want to buy your device after actually finding out that your device does not run Android? It runs a different version of Android. Not having that Google Play Store is a big deal, because like I said, that's where you get all your applications for your smartphone, and on top of that, that's one of the best app stores in the world when it comes to applications. So you can see not having that is going to be a very big deal for Huawei, and it's very hard. Now, there is some good news for Huawei owners if you currently own a Huawei device right now. As we speak right now, it looks like if you do hold a Huawei device, you are going to still get supported by Google. It's not like they're not going to support you, even though there is this ban going on for Huawei products and things like that. It looks like you are going to be supported. I think I heard somewhere, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the was 90 days they're going to keep supporting some of these older devices, at least when it comes to updates and things like that. I think when the 90 days comes up, you're going to be unsupported. So even so, it's still going to be a very risky thing to hold on to a Huawei device, because ultimately, who knows what's going to happen to your smart device? Are you still going to be able to access the Google Play Store? Is your Android device still going to run properly? So overall, it's a very risky situation as we speak to own a Huawei certified Android device. Just very, very risky, but that's the chance you take with a lot of these different manufacturers, and overall it's just a very risky thing. So in the long run, what is Huawei actually going to do when it comes to their smartphones specifically? What are they going to do? Now, they do have a lot of different options they could take when it comes to this ban and trying to get around this ban and trying to keep producing smartphones. As of right now, they're still making smartphones, and it looks like they're going to continue on to keep making smartphones as long as possible. It looks like for the foreseeable future, at least when it comes to Huawei, it looks like they're not going to be going anywhere. Like I said before, they're one of the biggest manufacturers of smartphones, so if they were going to go broke anytime soon, it would probably be a ways down the road. It wouldn't be like it would just happen tomorrow or even a year from now. I think it would take quite some time for them to go broke, but bans do not help companies, and it's already proven. I think there was a company called ZTE that also got banned with America and things like that, and they actually had to close their doors specifically because the ban was just too much since they ran on Android, and since they weren't as big as Huawei, they didn't have a lot of money in the bank, they really couldn't get around the ban. But let's go back to the ban specifically and talk about what ways Huawei could get around the ban. Now, like I said before, Huawei could actually use the unofficial Android certified version. They could put that on their smartphones, and that's how they could get around. But I don't think they actually want to do that, just because there's no Google certification. So that means you won't have access to things like Google services, and Google Play Store is a very big deal. There's actually these articles coming out right now as we speak talking about how Huawei is in development to develop their own OS. If any of the big smartphone brands could do that, it would definitely be Huawei, because like I said again, I keep going back to the fact that Huawei has so much money in the bank. It would make sense that Huawei would be the one company to want to make their OS. So it looks like they could be making their OS behind the scenes, and apparently from a lot of these different websites, it looks like their OS could be coming out as early as this fall, but ultimately still that does not help them at all. It still does hurt them in the long run, because you have to take in consideration a lot of consumers don't want to change OSs when they've been with the same OS for so many years, whether we're talking about iOS or whether we're talking about Android. They know Android's been around for a while. They know iOS has been around for a while. So what happens when a new OS comes to the mix? Pretty much when a new OS comes to the mix, it's really hard to take faith in a brand new OS. Who knows how long it's going to be supported? And then on top of that, even if Huawei does decide to make their new OS for their own operating system, that ultimately means some people won't want to buy their smartphones because they don't know how well this OS is going to be supported. They don't know what's going to happen with Huawei, since Huawei is already in a pretty big mess when it comes to their business of their smartphones and things like that. They don't know how long Huawei is going to stay in business, and just for this ban specifically, it's very risky to buy a Huawei phone. So they already have a lot of things that are going against them when it comes to their company. But yes, it looks like Huawei is going to be making their own OS. Now, who knows what type of app store is going to be on their own OS, because if you know anything about smartphones, or if you don't know anything about smartphones, there's actually more OS app stores than you think. There's actually more than the Apple App Store, and there's actually more than the Google Play Store. There's all these different app stores that are currently out on the market, and believe it or not, Huawei actually has their own app store, but unfortunately Huawei's own app store is not as great as the Google Play Store. That's why most likely every time you see a Huawei device, you see an Android device from Huawei that does have the Google certification on it, because people just do not want to develop for the Huawei App Store. They want to develop for the biggest app store in the world next to the Apple App Store. So you can see why their own app store is very lackluster and lapsed, and the quality is not going to be good. So they don't want to use that. So what they may end up using, they could end up using that, or with a lot of these different OSs, like if they made their own OS specifically for their smartphones to get around the ban, what they could actually do in the long run is make an OS where you can actually sideload applications, because if you know anything about Android, you can sideload apps through APKs, and you could actually sideload the Google Play Store or sideload a different app store. Like for instance, if you didn't know this, Amazon actually has their own app store. I don't know how they can get to that if Amazon is an American-based company, but who knows ways around that. They could get ways around that, and they could potentially use the Amazon App Store. And Amazon has owned their own App Store for quite some time now, and it's no surprise. Is it the same quality as the Google Play Store? No, it's not the same quality as the Google Play Store, but I would assume the Amazon App Store compared to Huawei's own App Store is going to be miles better, so they may end up doing that. But overall, this situation just does not seem good for Huawei. But for me personally, what do I think Huawei is going to end up doing in the long run? Do I even think they're going to go bankrupt from all this ban talk and everything like that? Honestly, I don't think Huawei is going to go anywhere. I don't think we're going to have another ZTE thing on our hands when it comes to Huawei, because like I said, they have so much money in the bank, and like I said already, they already have stuff coming out, and Huawei, out of all companies, was already planning for this ban to happen anyway, so they've been prepared for the long run. Like I said, a lot of these other articles come out saying they're going to start their own app.